Nobody had seen anything quite like it. The most ridiculous and early starting F1 driver market that even F1's most experienced driver managers and team bosses could remember. An absurdly long-running saga to set the 2025 grid finally came to an end in December last year when Red Bull confirmed Sergio Perez would be replaced by Lawson and Isack Hadjar got promoted to a Racing Bulls seat. It means that this year, half the grid is changing, 12 months on from the lineup staying the same from the end of one season to the start of the next for the first time ever. Unprecedented stability has given way to ridiculous levels of driver turnover, and so much happened in settling the final grid that various connections now seem like a very distant memory, and it's easy to forget just how interlinked so many people's fortunes were. The irony is that the first driver moves for 2025 actually threatened a boring more of the same narrative, with Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris tying themselves to Ferrari and McLaren for the long term respectively. But when news broke on February the 1st about Lewis Hamilton's stunning switch to Ferrari for 2025, it set off a cascade of events in the most dizzying driver market there's ever been. The Hamilton news had a seismic impact up and down the grid as drivers, their managers and team bosses were all put on red alert for what the knock-on effects would be. Mercedes hotshot Kimi Antonelli, yet to even start his rookie F2 season at 17 years old, immediately entered the frame. But he wasn't the only one. Carlos Sainz and Fernando Alonso were also in the initial picture, and Toto Wolff paid polite lip service to the recently retired Sebastian Vettel too. Sainz's candidacy seemed most obvious, as no other remotely front-running team seemed interested in him, even after he returned from an appendectomy that caused him to miss the second round of the season in Saudi Arabia to win the Australian Grand Prix just a couple of weeks later. At the same time, a Red Bull saga almost as vast as the driver market one was kicking off in early 2024. It started with whether the Christian Horner controversy and a huge political war within Red Bull might drive Max Verstappen out the door. Mercedes was keen to take advantage by openly flirting with the Verstappens to offer him a way out, while Red Bull held preliminary conversations with Alonso as a potential Verstappen plan B. When Alonso re-signed with Aston Martin in April, that left Mercedes' priorities as 1. Signing Verstappen if he was available, 2. Promoting Antonelli if everything went well with his development, and 3. Choosing Sainz as the fallback. At Red Bull, Sainz was on the radar, but always a long shot, as Red Bull wasn't keen on reviving the Verstappen-Sainz Toro Rosso driver lineup from 2015 and early 2016, and Sainz never seemed to be considered a potential replacement should Verstappen leave. But Red Bull did have to weigh up its options for its second seat, as while Sergio Perez had started the season strong, he was out of contract, so his seat was up for grabs for 2025. Daniel Ricciardo's early struggles at the second Red Bull team dampened the prospect of him being put alongside Verstappen again and sparked very early speculation he could be dropped in season for Liam Lawson. So uncertain was Red Bull's path that it started to show some serious interest in another of its former drivers, Alex Albon. There was even talk in February of a pre-contract being offered, giving Red Bull first option on him from 2026, as his Williams contract covered 25. While Red Bull tends to operate in its own little ecosystem driver-wise, so sprawling was the driver market spread in 2024 that Red Bull's bouts of internal nonsense were not as ring-fenced from the wider world as normal, and this was just the start. Smaller F1 teams know how the game is played driver-wise. The big guns fire first, and then everyone's fighting over the leftovers. But incoming Audi had other ideas. The German manufacturer was initially very proactive in the driver market as it looked to secure drivers to lead Sauber's transition into becoming the Audi works team. So wide-ranging was its scouting that Red Bull Juniors Yuki Tsunoda and Lawson were strongly considered by then Audi F1 CEO Andreas Seidel. Audi's antics even put it head-to-head with Red Bull around springtime. Red Bull senior advisor Helmut Marko started talking about Audi making a massive offer for Sainz that Red Bull couldn't match. This was partly true, but Sainz was basically in talks with everyone: Red Bull, Mercedes, Audi, Williams, Alpine and even Haas. There were inevitably some smoke and mirrors here. Red Bull was trying to distance itself from Sainz because the real reason it had for not wanting him, that it would be too awkward with Verstappen, wasn't publicly a good look, so claiming it would be priced out was a convenient excuse. While Audi's bid might have been overplayed, its interest was serious. Sainz was its top target, just like he was for every midfield team, and it seemed really simple that Sainz was either going to hang on for Red Bull or Mercedes, or just settle for the Audi project. But Sainz was willing to wait, so he wasn't the first signature that Audi landed. Instead, it locked down Nico Hülkenberg very early in April. This had three consequences. It boiled the fight to drive for Audi down to a single seat, it made it clear that incumbent drivers Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu were low priority options and likely to be replaced, and it made a seat available at Haas, which was already weighing up replacing its other driver Kevin Magnussen. Sainz quickly became the cork in the driver market bottle. Even some moves that were separate from it were tangentially related. In May, Albon removed himself from any shred of contention for a Red Bull return, or potentially becoming an unexpected option for Mercedes further down the line by committing himself to the Williams project on a new, longer-term and financially rewarding multi-year deal. Williams was convinced that Albon was a great option for its ambitious project, especially as it had eyes on Sainz but knew it was an outsider in that fight. And while Albon was playing it safe by sticking to what he knew rather than rolling the dice on getting a bigger seat somewhere else, he also cashed in on his value being at an all-time high. Williams had a horrible start to 2024, but it was also becoming a more highly coveted midfield team. Logan Sargent was struggling to see out the season, let alone keep his drive for 25, and lots of drivers were in the mix. Bottas was an option and engaged in talks like Sainz. Mercedes youngster Antonelli kept being linked as a short-term loan option, while another contender was Esteban Ocon. It was an open secret that Ocon was likely to leave Alpine for 2025, and when he collided with teammate Pierre Gasly in Monaco at the end of May, then team boss Bruno Faman threatened to bench Ocon for the next race in Canada. While that didn't come to pass, it was announced before June's Canadian Grand Prix that Ocon would leave Alpine at the end of the year. As a quick interlude of some semi-detached Red Bull nonsense, this was the same time that a new Perez deal was confirmed to the end of 2026, despite just having an absolute shocker in Monaco, and it was announced that Tsunoda would be parked at the second team for another season. That took Tsunoda out of play at Audi, Haas and Alpine, all of which there had been conversations to different degrees, with Haas particularly keen. In turn, Haas became Ocon's most likely destination, as even though he's managed by Mercedes, he was never in the frame to take Hamilton's seat. Meanwhile, Alpine reserve Jack Doohan was quickly identified as a strong candidate to replace Ocon, while Bottas had some preliminary conversations with the Renault Works team as well. The longer Sainz held out forlornly in the hope a top seat would become available, the more his situation changed. Audi was no longer the obvious plan B, as it became a less appealing option despite the obvious potential. This was partly because Sauber's on-track form was so bad and Audi-level political infighting seemed to be proving disruptive, and also partly because two curveballs emerged. First, Williams became a serious rival. Talks had been happening for months, but around May and June is when it first looked like a realistic destination. There was even an expectation within Williams that Sainz could commit by the Spanish Grand Prix in late June, but that turned out to be one of several unofficial deadlines that would pass as Sainz continued to dither. This led to the second curveball, Alpine, but not as the works team as everyone knew it. Flavio Briatore's return as an executive advisor coincided with a proposal for Renault to drop its own engine program and become a Mercedes customer. Briatore insisted this was nothing to do with him, but it was his master plan, and it combined with some bold promises about what that would mean for Alpine competitively, and covered off a pretty simplistic, well, if you want a Mercedes engine, don't pick Williams, pick us strategy too. There was enough there for Sainz to take it seriously, and for Williams to be seriously concerned it would lose out. Talks with Bottas even progressed to the point where it seemed if Williams was willing to confirm a deal, Bottas was ready to sign, but most people were still stuck waiting come July. Some weren't interested in hanging around for the Sainz resolution. An unexpectedly competitive year for Haas had made F1's worst team from 2023 a surprisingly appealing prospect again, and team boss Ayo Komatsu was keen to take advantage. Komatsu had missed out on trying to retain Hülkenberg because team owner Gene Haas didn't want to engage in driver negotiations so early in the year, but Komatsu at least made sure this didn't linger until after the summer break. Ocon had a seat fit at Williams, but he wasn't plan A or plan B there, so cracked on with finalising a Haas move, but not before the long-anticipated confirmation in early July that Ferrari protege Ollie Bearman would get a full-time drive with Haas, despite a disappointing second F2 season. The Bearman deal had basically been on the table going into the year, which meant there was only really one Haas seat up for grabs once Hülkenberg's exit was known. That gave Magnussen a shot at sticking around, but he would have had a better chance had he performed in the first half of the year the way he would in the final races. Once Ocon was in the frame, Magnussen's chances looked bleak. He was kicked towards the F1 exit door yet again when Haas announced in mid-July he'd leave the team at the end of the year, and Ocon's eventual confirmation followed a week later. Perez's form nosedived as the season progressed, which led to the start of a second extensive wave of Red Bull nonsense. What the hell's it doing with its drivers? Just a couple of months after giving Perez his new deal, Red Bull considered dropping him as the August break approached. At the same time, Ricciardo was told he could be axed entirely, or if his turnaround in form in the second quarter of the season continued, he could potentially replace Perez at Red Bull Racing. Tsunoda remained in limbo as different factions disagreed over his top team candidacy, while Lawson was waiting in the wings with a contractual deadline to have an F1 move of some kind guaranteed by September. The whole thing reached an initial crisis point when it became known there would be a meeting between key Red Bull stakeholders at the start of August that would include a discussion over whether to drop Perez or not. He just about survived. There were commercial implications to dropping him and the likelihood of an extremely expensive payoff, all the while none of the alternatives were really making a stunning case that they'd do any better. So Perez earned a reprieve for the remainder of 2024, but the upshot was having finally rid itself of Mercedes' constant fishing for Verstappen, who ended whatever talks he was having with Mercedes boss Toto Wolff over the summer break. Red Bull looked more confused than ever about what to do with its second seat. While Red Bull was all at sea, the absolutely perfect driver to fix their problems finally decided his future. Sainz picking Williams, which was announced the day after the Belgian Grand Prix at the very start of the summer break, brought that saga to a conclusion that had lurched from unlikely to favourite destination to unlikely again, and then back to being the least worst option. That freed Alpine up to promote Doohan, who had seen off left field threat Mick Schumacher in an effective shootout test and was confirmed on the other side of the summer break. Sainz's choice was as huge a middle finger to massive manufacturer-backed Audi and Renault projects as it was a coup for Williams. Ultimately, the chaos engulfing his other realistic options was too off-putting. Audi changing its top management in late July didn't help, even though it was Mattia Binotto who took charge in place of Seidel and Audi's representative Oliver Hoffmann, Binotto being the person who had brought Sainz to Ferrari in the first place. That all happened too late to make a difference for Sainz, and there was also the growing realisation as 2024 progressed that Mercedes wasn't as interested in Sainz as he and his family thought he deserved. Mercedes was set on Antonelli, and the Sainz camp knew it. That's why Sainz actually made his decision a few weeks before the Mercedes seat was officially taken off the market. Antonelli wasn't announced until the last day of August at his home race in Italy, the day after he drove in free practice for Mercedes for the first time and crashed on his second flying lap. That made for an amusing if awkward subplot to the timing of Mercedes' long-planned announcement, but Mercedes had been convinced for a while that Antonelli's prodigious ability made him worth the risk. Toto Wolff even claimed he wanted to promote Antonelli as soon as Hamilton told him he was leaving. Back in the midfield though, the Williams and Alpine seats getting filled meant Bottas was now in a Sauber or nothing situation. Bottas had been determined to leave Sauber before the management change. That offered him an olive branch, and initial conversations seemed to be encouraging, but Binotto also immediately hinted that he could opt for a younger driver to partner the already signed Hülkenberg instead. Two more curveballs were thrown into the driver market by mid-season driver changes at two teams. First, Sargent's Williams exit, just one race after the summer break and between the Zandvoort Monza doubleheader. Williams team boss James Vowles never even pretended that Sargent was safe until the end of the year, so this almost felt inevitable. It also seemed irrelevant given Sainz had been announced for 2025, but it introduced a completely unexpected factor into the driver market: Sargent's replacement, Franco Colapinto. Colapinto got the Williams seat over Schumacher, who was snubbed by a second team in a matter of weeks, with Vowles so bluntly dismissing Mick as not a special talent he needed to apologise to him. The best case scenario for Colapinto was he stepped in and impressed so much at Williams that he forced his way into the equation elsewhere. And against all the odds for a driver so inexperienced, that's exactly what he did to start with. After a solid Monza debut, Colapinto scored points on his second start in Azerbaijan, put in a head-turning drive in Singapore, and rose from the back of the grid into the top 10 again in the US, a weekend where he looked more comfortable than Albon throughout. By October, Colapinto was on a few teams' radars, most notably Red Bull's, which was genuinely open to him as an option to partner Verstappen, not just slot into the second team. Such was Colapinto's initial reputation for being quick, aggressive, and very mentally strong. But Red Bull's own nonsense had escalated again because it had made a driver change of its own. Ricciardo was sacked in September, lasting 4 races after the summer break, with Lawson given another cameo alongside Tsunoda that was essentially an audition to be Perez's replacement for 2025. Colapinto and Lawson were also indirectly bad news for the likes of Bottas. They cemented a view that the next generation of drivers deserved a chance and were ready for F1, which Audi seemed to get particularly excited by. Even though these two drivers weren't its main target, another youngster was. Bottas was initially very confident that the changes at Sauber and Audi were good for him and that he was more likely to be on the grid in 2025 than not. His confidence was misplaced. Whether he and his representatives were misled by Binotto or the picture simply changed due to the uncertainty that defined this driver market, only a few people could say with certainty. But the longer it took for a Bottas deal to be done, the less likely it seemed that it would be. Bottas had a contract agreed and had even signed it himself, but the team was hanging fire. Bottas thought a deal could be done in September, but by November he was still waiting, and then Gabriel Bortoleto blazed in. The Formula 2 rookie, managed by Fernando Alonso's stable, was piecing together an extremely impressive championship challenge that ultimately ended in him beating Red Bull's Isack Hadjar to the title. Audi became convinced it needed to pair Hülkenberg with a young driver rather than have two drivers in their late 30s. But it wasn't interested in Sauber's own F2 champion Théo Pourchaire, so it chased McLaren Junior Bortoleto. A relatively swift period of negotiation with McLaren, which rated Bortoleto quite highly but knew it had no medium-term vacancy for him, was concluded by early November. That confirmed both Bottas and Zhou Guanyu would be on the sidelines in 2025, with Bottas getting a return to Mercedes as reserve driver as his consolation prize. The holdout to wrap up the driver market ended up being the team that effectively had 6 drivers under contract for 2025 back in June. Red Bull, we hope you never change. As Perez's terminal decline continued over the final races, the drivers vying to replace him took turns to impress. Nobody really stood out. Colapinto's viability faded almost as rapidly as it first emerged, with a series of crashes in Brazil and Las Vegas in November, and Albon ultimately getting back on top of him. That bumped Colapinto out of Red Bull contention entirely and meant interest also cooled at Alpine, which was surprisingly open to making room for him by easing Doohan out early. For Red Bull's own drivers, Lawson made a solid case but failed to outqualify Tsunoda for a Grand Prix. Meanwhile, Tsunoda just couldn't do anything to undo the reputation he seems to have been permanently branded with at Red Bull as a driver who lacks emotional control and consistency. That left Red Bull in a really strange place, even by its own standards. By early December, it was known that Red Bull wanted to replace Perez and was leaning towards Lawson, but wasn't 100% set and didn't know exactly how the Perez departure would work, as Perez was constantly deriding the speculation as fiction and insisting he had a contract. After his lap 1 retirement in the Abu Dhabi season finale though, Perez's tune finally changed and he admitted there would be discussions to resolve his situation. These December negotiations included Red Bull making it clear to Perez that if he didn't agree to move aside, his contract would be honoured in 2025 by making him a show pony and glorified reserve driver. Eventually, Perez ceded, and by late December a mutual agreement was struck. Perez got compensation, Red Bull was free to replace him, and picked Lawson over Tsunoda. That also opened up a spot at the second team to promote F2 runner-up Hadjar, the latest Red Bull Junior, to enter the maelstrom and take the total number of real rookies on the 2025 grid to 5. True to form, Red Bull kept this complicated, dragging out the announcements over 3 days. But by December the 20th, 2024, the full 2025 grid was finally set, a whopping 323 days after it had been thrown into chaos by Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari. There is a catch though. In early January 2025, Colapinto was announced as an Alpine test and reserve driver as the team decisively acted on its interest and struck a deal with Williams to sign Colapinto on a multi-year deal. That's been widely interpreted as Alpine making sure it can easily replace Doohan with Colapinto if it wants to, or whenever it's able to. So, remarkably, the full story of this ridiculous driver market might yet have a postscript several races into the 2025 season.